delighted to have John Martin come up and visit. He's a busy guy. John started out life at Scripps, not quite life, but life as we know it. Back at Scripps.
Greatest place on earth.
But has been ensconced in the Gator Nation at the University of Florida for quite a while. I first ran across John's work way back when we started doing submarine groundwater discharge, and those in the know might recognize a long string of publications from the Indian River Lagoon and other places. He works in general on the geochemistry of karst deposits, carbonate deposits, and water in groundwater interactions. For some unknown reason, he went from the tropics to Greenland. Well, I don't know, about 70 degrees north or so. It's pretty high, pretty far up there. And we're talking about weathering in Greenland. Greenland. That's where I live.
That's going to be a hard warm-up act to follow here. Boy, I'm really surprised to see this guy here, although I knew you were here. I'd just forgotten it. And thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Henry, for having me come up here. And I know you're a little surprised about this talk, and I'll actually explain how I got from cars to here in a second. I hadn't planned to do that, but I will do that now that you mentioned it. So first, I should start with acknowledgments. I want to acknowledge my co-authors. There's me, and there's Ellen Martin. She's not my sister. Okay, we're related. She's not my sister. John knows Ellen. And I've debated telling this joke too or not, but I might as well. You guys are all adults, right? This is the first project we've collaborated on since our son Eric was born 21 years ago. So we finally made our way up through the academic ranks and decided we could start working together. And so this has been really a fun project for us to work on. The other people who are listed here, one's Kelly Durling. She's shown right here sampling the Greenland ice sheet. She's a PhD student who will be graduating in about 4 days, on election day, in fact. And this talk is largely her dissertation, so bear with me if I don't understand it very well. Cecilia's right here. She's sampling some bedload sediment from a Deglacial watershed in Greenland. And then Daniel Galazzo back here was an undergraduate who did an undergraduate thesis with me. He's now at Colorado State working on a master's degree. And then Daniel Fisher is a new PhD student who just started last year, and he's going to continue this project forward for his dissertation. I also need to acknowledge the funding agency. We started this through an internal grant from the university. That morphed into a National Geographic grant that got me back to Greenland. The university sent me to Greenland the first time. National Geographic sent me back the following summer. We had, in that time, written a proposal to NSF and thought, well, this is the first time applying to polar programs. We're never going to get it. We went to Greenland, did some of the work we had proposed to do through the National Geographic grant, realized that the proposal we had proposed to NSF was not going to work whatsoever, that we had completely misunderstood the system. But we thought, that's okay. We'll hear when we get back, and we can resubmit because it will be rejected. The week I got back, NSF called, said, congratulations, you're funded. And I had to say, well, this isn't going to work. And they graciously expanded our project, so they gave us some helicopter time. We got to go to new places, and so it worked out. So they funded us, and they've actually funded us again now, so we'll be back next summer. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So why Greenland? Greenland is an interesting place because it is one of the places in the North American hemisphere where there is still a large ice sheet, and that ice sheet has retreated back, so it's exposed some foreland areas of Greenland, of the island. And in that foreland area of Greenland and actually any other place that had ice sheets on it at one time, you can sort of separate watersheds into three kinds, three flavors, if you will. One of them is this subglacial watershed where you have water pouring out from underneath the glaciers. This, in fact, is why I started working in Greenland or getting interested in it, because this kind of a system is exactly like karst hydrology. There are conduits, there's matrix flow, it all coalesces, it discharges. And the original internal proposal from UF that got me to Greenland the first time was to study these kind of places. That also failed miserably, but in the meantime, I just realized that there are these other kinds of watersheds. So There's what we call a proglacial watershed. This is where water that's discharged from underneath the ice sheet or off the top of the ice sheet coalesces and forms these very large rivers that flow to the ocean. Okay, but they're connected to the ice sheet. The water in these proglacial watersheds and the sediments have come directly from the ice sheet. So very young systems. Okay. Then there are also these deglacial systems. They're separated from the ice sheet by hydrologic divides. And in this case, these are all moraines and tills and old glacial sediments. These are much older systems that are just draining annual precipitation and permafrost melt. So different sources of water, different kinds of sediments. The significance of this is that in here, like I said, these are very young sediments. They've just been generated by grinding of the ice sheets across the landscape. And then these are young sediments too, whereas these are the older. And so what happens is that you would expect there's going to be an increasing amount of weathering age, length of time of exposure from here to here. And that means that the solutes that are generating and the fluxes that come out of these systems to the oceans are going to differ because of the different kinds of weathering. And Greenland, like I mentioned, is an interesting place to do this because it is a microcosm of the North American ice sheets where the large North American ice sheets were. So, for example, you could look at what the Earth looked like during the last glacial maximum where the Laurentide ice sheet extended down to right here where we're standing, Long Island, right, is a moraine, glacial moraine. And then there's also the Northern European, the Siberian, the Finno-Scandinavian ice sheets. And then this is what it looks like now. So in the past 20,000 years, you've had this ice out here that has retreated from here all the way up to Greenland, or left this remnant cap right here. So in effect, all of these areas, Siberia and Canada, are those deglacial watersheds. They have been glaciated, the ice is now gone, and it's just draining these older moraine tills, those older tills and moraines. So what does that mean about weathering? All right, when I say weathering, what is it I'm really talking about? And I'm going to get a little bit down in the weeds here about this, so just bear with me. And this comes from a lot of work that was done in Wyoming back around 2000 or so. Bloom, Errol, Harlevan, a bunch of these people looked at the radiogenic isotopic composition of moraine materials in Wyoming. So these are mountain glaciers. And what they did was they took sediments or moraine tills that had varying ages. So this goes from about 1,000 years to 100,000 years. These are different ages of moraines. That's the glaciers waned and waxed. And they measured the strontium isotopic composition of the bulk sediment of those tills. And that's what's represented here by this dashed line. They then performed an experimental leaching experiment on them to see what kind of isotope ratios could be extracted from those materials. Right? And that leach, it's a very weak acid leach, is supposed to mimic what the weathering is of those materials. And as you can see, that's what's shown in this solid line. And so what you can see is that in these older moraines, it's more or less congruent. Okay, we use this word congruent. It's a little bit different terminology from thinking mineral congruent dissolution or incongruent dissolution. But in this term, in the radiogenic isotope world, congruence means that this leach material and the bulk parent material have the same isotopic value. But in these younger ones, you can see that they're highly incongruent. That is, the leach material here has a much higher radiogenic isotope ratio than the bulk material. And so what's happened is these have reached essentially equilibrium with the leaching fluids and have extract the same isotope ratio as the solid phases do. And in a nutshell, what that boils down to, well, actually, let me back up. The reason for this is because of the different minerals that are being leached. So these really high strontium radiogenic isotopes come from biotite, basically. And what it means is that biotite in these older ones have already been leached away, and they're not there. So in a nutshell, what it means is those rocks aren't weathering. It's the mineral phases within the rocks that are weathering that give you this change in strontium isotope ratios. Okay? You all with me still? Okay. The same thing happens with lead. Okay, so this is a different study, but basically the same idea. Here's the bulk lead isotope ratio, the isotope ratio of the bulk sediment, and this is the isotope ratio of the lead of the leachate. Same sort of age range from 1,000 years to 100,000 years or so, million years. Okay, In this case, though, it's a little bit different mechanism. It has the same effect, but it's a little bit different mechanism that gives the different strontium isotope ratios. Here, what happens is that the radiogenic lead, the lead-208, or radioactive lead, actually, is leached from damaged crystal lattices in the mineral. So as the radioisotope decays, it damages the lattice. It makes it easier for it to be extracted. And given enough time, all that easily extracted lead is removed from the solid phases and then goes to the river. Regardless of the mechanism, though, it has the same effect of having young, less weathered material giving you more radiogenic solutes, more radiogenic leachates. The interesting aspect of this to us, and this is what really got us started on this project, is that this lead signal is recorded in marine sediments, all right? And I'm going to give you a little caveat here. We initially were planning to use lead in our study, but it turns out that lead everywhere is contaminated with anthropogenic lead. So it's very difficult to get pristine isotope ratios from modern watersheds because they will already have this anthropogenic contamination. So we use strontium as a proxy for that, and I'll show you that as we go through the details of the talk. Okay, but to go back to this, the interesting aspect about this is that this signal of changing and weathering is observed in marine sediment records. And so this is a little bit confusing plot because I cobbled together things and squished and stretched it, but I'll just walk you through it really quickly. This is the sea level curve, okay, starting from the last glacial maximum here about 24,000 years ago or so. So you have low sea level, and then as the ice sheets retreat, obviously you get this very rapid change in sea level. And corresponding with that are these lead isotope records. So this is a lead isotope record from 3 different locations along the North American east coast. One from Orphan Knoll, shown here in yellow, which is located up here north of the Labrador Sea. One is in the Laurentian Fan here, and one is at the Blake Ridge very far to the south. And what was noticed is that, or what you can see, is that during this last glacial maximum, there were relatively low lead isotope ratios. This is when the ice sheet was completely covering North America. And then with that retreat, as shown by sea level, the isotope ratios go up very quickly. If you remember back to the lead isotope, that means that this is less congruent, showing you less congruent weathering. In other words, weathering of newly deposited material. And then there's a sort of slow decline once sea level reaches its current high stand. All right. And so what we were interested in looking at is, in detail, what happened as this ice sheet was migrated from here all the way back to where it is now during this lead isotope record. Okay? So it basically goes from discharge from this type of world largely being proglacial, subglacial type weathering to this kind of world where discharge out of the watersheds are from the deglacial watersheds. Back up here. So, oops. The place that we chose to do this, and I'll show you in more detail, is right here in western Greenland, because you can see this is where the Greenland ice sheet originally was out on the continental shelf and has now migrated back, and it's left us this window of deglacial watersheds that we can work in. I'll show you a bigger map of that in a moment. So what are these weathering products that could be interesting to look at in terms of oceanic fluxes? Okay. Well, one we already have seen is radiogenic isotopes, and we use that. They know that from the lead isotope records in the marine sediments, that those have changed through time as the ice sheets retreat. Others that are likely to be very important are iron and nitrogen and phosphorus, nutrient delivery to the ocean as these ice sheets retreat. In fact, there's a paper published this year that talks about a Mississippi's worth of phosphorus discharging out of this river right here, the Watson River, out of western Greenland. So it's this could be this enormous source of phosphorus to coastal oceans. And then another one is carbon. Obviously, carbon is going to be an important component of this flux. Bob Eller's here. I don't know if I should show this or not. I've never met Bob before now, but it makes me a little nervous to stand here and talk. I feel like in my qualifying exam again.
There is a question period after.
Oh, I'm gonna run long then. So obviously, this is well known that weathering of calcium magnesium silicate minerals draws down atmospheric CO2 that's returned by volcanism in the mid-ocean ridges and other places, and this long-term global cycle. Well, the question is, what happens in some detail as these ice sheets retreat? What is that carbon sink? Is there a carbon sink? Does it change from a carbon sink to a carbon source? I don't think those are very well known. Today I'm going to mostly talk about these radiogenic isotopes, and I'm going to sort of end up with doing a little preliminary discussion of carbon weathering stuff. So the obligatory hypotheses here, and maybe I've already mentioned this. The hypothesis that we really tested in this project that I'm talking about is that the weathering extents and the products, the solute distribution or discharge from the watersheds should vary depending on what kind of watershed it is and how old the watershed is. So I would say, yeah, okay, I'm going to tell you about that. This change in the watershed temps and the solutes should vary as the ice sheet retreats, and you gain more and more relative amount of the deglacial watersheds as opposed to the proglacial watersheds. And I'll say, yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but there's still a lot of open questions that we need to get to for that one. And then the really critical one is the hypothesis that ocean and atmospheric fluxes are going to change depending on the proportions of these different kinds of watersheds. And that one, I'm going to say, no, we don't have a clue. And that's because we're missing some critical pieces of data that I'll talk about in a moment, that we can't actually quantify the amount of fluxes, but it looks like they are going to change. They do change as the ice sheet retreats from being all subglacial to being proglacial and then largely deglacial. Okay, so here's the meat of the talk. I'll zip through this pretty quickly. I'll try to. And here's where we've been working. We spent one field season here where we keep getting the wrong button. Where we sampled these 5 watersheds, 4 of them deglacial: Sissamute, Narramack, Kalortok, Kangerlussuaq, and then the Watson River here, which is a proglacial system draining from underneath the Greenland ice sheet that's shown right here. This transect's located right here. It's about 125 kilometers. It's really actually about 160 up to the ice sheet. So it's a pretty wide swath of exposed landscape. Okay. The good thing about this place is that the bedrock is basically all the same. It's an Archean gneiss of the, I'll give anybody $5 if they can say that. I can't. I practiced this before I came. I swear I did. Nagsuktukidian. Okay. Nice. Archean gneiss. Nagsuktukidian. I'll give anybody $5 if they can tell me what that means in Greenlandic. I don't know. It means Nagsuktukidian. I don't know what it means, but it's constant. The point is, it's a constant lithology, so that the weathering, the changes that we see in the solute compositions of the water, depend solely on the weathering, not on changes in the lithology. And so the other interesting thing about this area that we knew about when we started was that there's a gradient in exposure ages. So these white dashed lines tell you the ages of the moraines that have been dated by a variety of methods. And so out of the coast, the moraines there are around 10,000 years old. Basically, the ice sheet was back here around 10,000 as it retreated back across the landscape, to one that's around 6.8 thousand years right up near the ice sheet. There's an additional moraine where the ice sheet actually retreated back farther than where it is now, and then grew back towards the coast during the Little Ice Age, and now has retreated back again. So there's exposures of rocks in here, or actually tills in here, that are on the order of 500 years or so. So we really have this wide range of ages. The part that we didn't understand until we got there was that, and this is actually the part that we found out through the National Geographic funding, that I had to call NSF and say, no, we actually need to go work out here. Originally, we just planned to work back here. But the water balance changes, okay? And that means the watersheds change. So inland here, because of katabatic winds that blow off the top of the ice sheet, is very dry. It's desert-like. So there's actually a negative water balance here, about minus 150 millimeters a year or so. And then because of the marine influence out here, there's a positive water balance. And that change in the water actually turns out to be the major driver of the changes in the weathering that we see here, along with the different ages. Okay, so in a little more detail then, we've studied these two watersheds, Sissamute and Aramac, and these two, Quarlartok and Lake Helen, which we group into two types of deglacial watersheds. One of which is colder, wetter, older, and it shows definitely more congruent weathering. And then these inland sites where it's drier and younger moraines has much less congruent weathering. It looks like weathering of fresher material. And then, oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to use these same color codes through data slides that I have coming up. So the coastal ones are in these cooler colors, and the inland ones are more in the red colors. There's this fifth moraine in the Watson River right here, which is the Proglacial system. And I'm going to show that in yellow as we work through this system. Okay, so here we go. I hope this works. Let's see. Let me see if I can turn that on. So this is, just to give you a heads up here, that this is Kangerlussuaq, the town of Kangerlussuaq, and this is a bridge that goes across the Watson River, which you can see right here. Well, now it's going underneath the Watson River. And this bridge goes across to a big reservoir up here that supplies the water to the town. The town has maybe about 500 people in it or so. It's also the major airport in Greenland, so a lot of traffic through there. But this was in, let's see here. This was during 2012, which is when about almost 100% of the ice sheet was melting. It's one of the biggest melt years they've had ever on record. It's and so we're looking upstream, obviously, swinging around. It will eventually see the bridge. I had just walked across the road. And then you swing down, and then that's the Kangerlussuaq fjord off in the distance there. Okay. And then this one is, let me see if I go forward. Let me see if I can do this. How do I go forward? There we go. So this is the same river, about the same time. This is the tractor that they were using trying to save the bridge. To give you a sense of the power of this river, a lot of it actually discharge. The guys.
How long is the melt season?
I have a record of it in a minute, but it's about 100 days or so, and it definitely ramps up and then ramps back down as the temperatures rise. Yeah, ask questions if you have, if something's clear. So please interrupt. So, okay, let's see where we go. Oh, sorry. Hey, yeah.
How long this much discharge basically passes the river? Is it like a one-day event, or it's
I'll show you the discharge data in a minute, but it actually ramps up, and then this high of flow could last for a week or so. But there are diurnal variations in the flow because there's 24 hours of daylight, but at nighttime it's colder because the sun drops low on the horizon and then rises. So there are daily changes in the thing. So yeah, but this goes on a long time. So I'm going to have, there are sort of two parts of this talk, and I'm going to first start with this part of the talk is going to focus on the Watson River. Then I'm going to switch and talk about the deglacial system compared to the Watson River. And what I'm showing you, I keep getting the wrong buttons here. I'm showing you strontium isotope ratios, potassium chloride and sodium chloride ratios downstream in the Watson River. So right here is at the headwaters. This is at the ice sheet. And then this is down where we just saw at the bridge, at the confluence with the Kangerlussuaq fjord. Obviously, we ratioed a chloride to get rid of marine aerosol introduction. So these changes in the compositions in potassium, sodium, and strontium isotope ratios basically reflect weathering that is occurring within the proglacial system. And as you can see, in the upper half of the river, more or less, you get this really rapid rise in the amount of weathering. And then in the downstream half of the river, it's more or less constant weathering. Okay, and there are a lot of details here I'm going to skip over But what I want to point out is, or talk about is one possibility for why you would get this rapid increase and then a constant change in the amount of weathering based on various solute concentrations. And the main idea is that in this upper portion of the river, it's actually fairly steep. The bed load's different. It's coarse cobbles, granules. And then once you reach about this point, in this inflection point in the chemistry, the river bed itself changes characteristics, and it becomes these kind of really large sediment flats. Their name is Sander in glaciology terms. And it's basically a glacial outwash plain where the valley of the river is now filled up with this very thick section of sand and sediment. And so we've sampled two of these things to get at this question, and that is the reason is, if the reason is for that constant change or non-change in the composition of the river has to do with hyporheic exchange across the bed, the river bed. And for those of you who don't know that word hyporheic, it's just basically submarine groundwater discharge, like Henry says, only it's in a river. So you have a bed here between the sediment, the river sediment, and the river water itself. And for a variety of reasons, there's water exchanged across that interface. Once you get an exchange across an interface, a lot of things happen because you have lower water-rock ratios, lower water-sediment ratios, longer residence times, a lot of reactions occur. And the idea is that the change in the composition of the river downstream is a result of this exchange and more reactivity. And so the way we did this is just like doing submarine groundwater discharge experiments where we set up a transect of piezometers across the edge. This is the Watson River, but we're a good 20 kilometers upstream from where we saw it before, and this was also not a very big melt season. We measured the hydraulic conductivity. It's very high. It's like a gravel aquifer like you would expect. And we sampled pore waters using this vapor probe, which is basically just a tube hooked up to a peristaltic pump where we can gather water samples. And so this is a plot of those pore water compositions with depth in the sediment. Here's the river water elevation. And this is all I'm going to show you is specific conductivity here to demonstrate that, yes, those pore waters have much higher solute concentrations than the river water themselves. This river water is ice melt, so it's very pure. It's sort of 5 to 10 microsiemens per centimeter conductivity. And then the pore waters you can see here on the orders of hundreds of microsiemens per centimeter. The other thing that is of interest here is that the downstream most sandier has the higher specific conductivity, suggesting that this site has more weathering than the upstream site where we just get into this section of river that's full of sand dunes. Looking in details at the composition, what I'm showing here is just the cation compositions on this ternary diagram. And you can see that those downstream sites, these cool colors, tend towards having more sulfate in them, and the upstream sites tend to have more bicarbonate in them. We take this as a reflection of what kind of acid is generated to cause the weathering, where the higher amount of sulfate is likely to come from this iron sulfide oxidation reaction generating sulfuric acid. And indeed, these have, well, actually, these have lower pHs because of the stronger acid. But upstream, with a higher bicarbonate, results from this hydration of CO2 to carbonic acid that may drive it. And this question of whether it's carbonic acid or sulfuric acid is going to come back later in the talk. So just recall that there are these two different kinds of acids, and that they drive different kinds of weathering. Okay? So then the question is, this is just a quick demonstration that weathering is occurring in the pore waters. Then you have to think about how do you exchange that pore water with the river water? Okay, it has to go back and forth somehow. There's got to be some physical mechanism to do this. And I will show you here in one more video, this is the last one, but how this could happen. Let's see if this works. Do I want OK? Let me try that. I don't know about Edge. Do I want to open that? All right. So this is a time-lapse photography that a student of ours took starting, this is about 9 p.m. at night, and it ends about 9 a.m. in the morning. this is the headwaters of the Watson River. So this is the Greenland ice sheet right here, and the Watson up here is just draining out of what's called a subglacial outlet portal. So there's a spring basically coming out from underneath the ice, and then it flows down this way. And we did a 24-hour sampling period here, and he took this time series photograph of the river. And so there's Kelly and Mike sampling periodically. So we're getting into about midnight now, and you can see that the river is beginning to drop. If you keep an eye here, it's going down, and then it'll start to come back up, start to flood over here. Okay? So in a very small way, you can see, at least in this case, that the river does go up and down given the change in the temperature of the air with sunrise or sunset. Here's the river discharge, a record of the river discharge, which a couple of you guys have been asking about over one melt season. I think this is 2010. This is the most extreme one that I could find, so that's why I would obviously show it. And you can see here the melt season. This is day of the year, so about June or so, it starts to melt and it starts to discharge. You get these big peaks, and then it goes off as the sun sets and it gets colder and starts to freeze the ice sheet again. The point of this is to show you that there are these diurnal variations. This isn't a big way because this is the gauging station at the bridge that I just showed you. These changes, these diurnal changes, the biggest ones like right here, right in here, are around 300 cubic meters a second, which to me didn't mean a whole lot, but I thought, well, I'll see what it's compared to. And I looked up the Hudson River. That's about half the Hudson River discharge, which is on the order of 600 cubic meters a second. All right, so daily that amount of water changes, and the head changes. Okay, head changes mean that you're going to have pressure changes, head changes across interfaces. In particular, this interface here, if we go back to the Watson River and what exchanges with the pore waters, it's because of this diurnal fluctuation. At least one of the reasons is the diurnal fluctuation in the elevation of the river and the elevation of the water table here drives pressure gradients or head gradients across that interface, which is shown here. And this is what we've measured in the piezometers. The red one is the closest to the river, and then these other colors are farther away from the river. When it's positive, when this head gradient is positive, the way we've set it up, the gradient is oriented towards the river, and when it's negative, it's oriented towards the bank. So this nearest piezometer has water, as you can see, first flowing to the river and then subsequently flowing back into the pore spaces. And then these other ones that are farther away from the river are continuously oriented away from the river. But we were there during melt season, the beginning of the melt season, so the river is continuously rising. So you would expect that this river water is flowing back this way all the time, except for the nearest one that has the water level in the river going up and down on a diurnal scale. And so to put that into some kind of a conceptualization drawing of it, what we see is that daily near the bank, you get the water level changed, and water first flows in and then flows out. And during the beginning of the melt season, as this river level continues to rise and rise and rise, this whole system moves back towards the bank of the river. And then during the freezing season, the end of the melt season, when the river starts to drop again, all of this water is going to flow back in, provided it's not frozen before it can flow back out. So there's this continual annual exchange of pore water and river water, and the pore water has different chemistries from the river water itself. Okay, are you with me? This is the Watson River. This is a proglacial system. So what about the deglacial system? I've already impressed you with these big videos and lots of water flowing off and Hudson rivers and all this sort of stuff. What about deglacial, like this bucolic meadow here full of mosquitoes and fun things to sample? Well, okay, intuitively you'd say, well, this is not the Watson River. It's not going to carry much solutes. But it turns out that if you integrate that across the landscape, there's so many more of these smaller watersheds that the sum of the discharge from these deglacial watersheds, this is just western Greenland, is on the same order of magnitude as these proglacial systems. So the proglacial system discharges in the dark black. This is over a 30-year period. And then these deglacial systems are in the light gray. So it's about the same. And so if the composition of the water in those two different watersheds is the same, the flux would be the same. But if the composition is different, because the weathering is different, then the flux to the oceans are going to be different as well. And so that's what we're going to do now, is go to these deglacial systems and look and see what their compositions are, what controls those compositions of the river. And the first thing to do, like in Harlevan did in Wyoming, is look at the strontium isotope ratios to see if the weathering is more or less congruent. And so that's what we've done here. I have on these slides the Watson River data, and it's more complicated than I have a chance to talk about, so I'm going to ignore that for right now. But I'm going to instead focus on these 5 different watersheds. This is an extra one, but mainly these 4 that are deglacial system. And you can see that these inland sites, the Kangerlussuaq and the Lake Helen sites, have very incongruent weathering. There's much higher strontium isotope ratios in the stream waters, which are these symbols, versus the bedload here. And that congruence, they become more congruent as we move to the coastal system. So this is a more extensively weathered system than the inland sites. In terms of their bulk major element chemistry, what we see here, and here what I've done is, well, actually Kelly did, but corrected these data for the marine aerosol contribution. And that's why on this anion ternary diagram there's no chloride, because we assume all the chloride is from marine aerosols. And so it just moves back to either sulfate or bicarbonate. And I've translated that into saying, OK, this is a sulfuric acid in member, and this is a carbonic acid in member of the kinds of acids that's driving weathering. And what you can see is that these coastal systems that have the more congruent weathering tend towards the sulfuric acid in member, and the inland sites tend more towards the carbonic acid in member. And that goes along with these changes in terms of the major element chemistry. So here's the calcium and magnesium in member, this is a silica in member, and this is the sodium and potassium in member. Silica and sodium come from silicate mineral weathering, and the bicarbonate, or excuse me, the calcium and magnesium come from carbonate mineral weathering. And it's a little bit of a cloud of points, but if you squint your eyes or take your glasses off like I would do, you would see that down here are the warm colors, meaning there's more carbonate weathering in here in these inland weather sites, and that the cooler colors tend to migrate towards more silica and more sodium and potassium, meaning there's more silicate weathering. So what essentially this is saying is that moving from inland sites, you're going from carbonic acid weathering of carbonate towards more sulfuric acid weathering of silicates. Okay, that's just a very qualitative way of saying what's happening across this landscape of deglacial watersheds. And so what Kelly did, and I give her full credit for this, is she did a mass balance calculation where she separated out the different acids and the different mineral phases that are weathering. And to do that, she started with her major element composition, corrected for marine aerosols. It turns out that there's cryogenic gypsum that precipitates. That affects the calcium and sulfate concentrations. So she has to make this correction for gypsum precipitation and dissolution as well. Once that's done, then, she can partition the calcium, magnesium, and bicarbonate into sulfuric acid weathering of carbonates. And then once she's done that, she takes the remainder of sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium and partitions it into sulfuric acid weathering of silicates. At that point, the sulfate is gone, and she can use the carbonate to partition sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium into silicates, and magnesium and calcium into carbonates weathered by carbonic acid. So we have 4 different things: sulfuric acid weathering of carbonates, sulfuric acid weathering of silicates, carbonic acid weathering of silicates, and carbonic acid weathering of carbonates. Okay? 4 things that we want to look at their distribution across these deglacial watersheds to see how those mineral phases and the acids evolve across that distribution of watersheds. The reason for doing this gets back to the CO2, because each of those mineral phases and each of the acids affect atmospheric CO2 in different ways. So if you look at carbonate weathering, the stoichiometry of this reaction, you're taking carbonic acid and calcium carbonate, the solid phase, and generating 2 bicarbonates. So essentially you're sequestering 1 CO2 by altering the carbon, dissolving carbonate minerals. Silicate weathering by carbonic acid, you're sequestering 2 atmospheric CO2s. Okay? And this is marine science, right? So this is probably old news, I hope. So Then, if you look at the sulfuric acid pathway, though, for dissolution of these minerals, if you take calcium carbonate and dissolve it with sulfuric acid, now you don't have CO2 from the atmosphere any longer. And instead, what you're doing is generating a CO2 to the atmosphere from that solid phase that was sequestered in the solid carbonate phase. So this is a source of CO2. And then there's no carbon at all involved with the sulfuric acid weathering of silicate minerals. Okay, so that doesn't affect it at all. So you have two sinks, one twice as big as the other, and one source of CO2. So as these evolve across the landscape in these different deglacial watersheds, the CO2 sequestration or source is going to change, or should change, if there's a change, if it evolves across the landscape. And I put this slide in here not to really give you any new information, just to show you that, yeah, we can do it in terms of the different components of these 4 different mechanisms for dissolving silicates, and to mention the problems that we have in being able to actually fully quantify that. One is that we have no discharge data. So all of this is done per liter. We don't know the total fluxes of these materials until we can get a complete discharge from these different watersheds. Okay? And that's what we're hopefully going to be doing next summer. The other one is that there's a range in specific conductivity across this watershed, so that the inland sites have much higher specific conductivity, meaning more dissolved solutes, meaning more weathering, meaning more acid has been involved than the coastal ones. And we have to quantify that as well to make sure that, to be able to quantify the total fluxes of these solutes out of the watersheds, or the CO2 fluxes. Okay. And so we do that. The way we do this is we do this per liter, okay, calculate these fractions per liter, and then do it on a 100% basis. So in other words, we're just looking at the fractions of these different dissolution weathering pathways. And I'll take a second here to walk you through this. It's not that complicated once you figure it out. I have to do this every time I look at this figure. So we have silicate weathering in the warm colors, driven by carbonic acid, which is in the orange, and by sulfuric acid, which is in the yellow but has hatches. And then carbonate mineral weathering is in the cool colors, and by carbonic acid, the solid again. So carbonic acid are the solids, the hatches are the sulfuric acid, the warm are silicate minerals, and the blue are carbonate minerals. This one right here is the Watson River, so ignore that. Okay, I can talk about that later, but I don't. I'm running out of time. But you can see that in the the deglacial watersheds, there is a distinct change in weathering minerals and weathering acids moving from the inland sites out here near the ice sheet towards the coast. In the fact that the sulfuric acid weathering, these hatched lines, increases, and the silicate minerals begin to increase at the expense of weathering of carbonate minerals by carbonic acid. All right, that's pretty consistent across this transect. All right. And so what that means for CO2 is shown here, and this is the CO2 flux that we can get out of that mass balance by counting up the amount of CO2 that's been sequestered or released. And so in all cases, there's CO2 sequestration. But the sequestration is greatest in these inland sites, which we would expect, where you have the most weathering by carbonic acid. And then that sequestration of CO2 decreases moving towards the coast, which you would expect because you have less weathering and an increase in the sulfuric acid weathering. And that increase in sulfuric acid weathering not only weathers silicates with no change in the CO2, but it also weathers carbonates there that is a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. Okay? And so what we're hoping to do is quantify this in terms of total fluxes of the CO2 by getting stream gauging measurements over the next 2 field seasons. Okay, you all with me? Because I think I have some implications and conclusions, so a couple more slides here. And I think I've maybe stressed this enough now, but I'll go through it anyway. What we think we're finding is that as the ice sheet retreats across the landscape, that, well, obviously, deglacial watersheds, you're going to get more deglacial watersheds than proglacials, just because there's more land surface area for this to occur. But what we've shown is that this the weathering acids, the predominant weathering acids, and the minerals that are weathering, and the intensity all changes with this retreat of the ice sheets. And this is really going to affect CO2 sequestration and oceanic fluxes of iron. I haven't even talked about this: iron, phosphorus, probably nitrogen, all these species. And the question really is, how much is that going to, how are those going to change? So, for example, as the ice sheet first retreats, are there a big flush of nutrients and a big algal bloom that draws CO2 down into the oceans? There are a lot of implications to that. Then secondly, this retreat is not a steady state process. It's going to be a rapid retreat. You're going to have a bunch of exposed minerals. Maybe you're going to have high radiogenic isotopes and CO2 sequestration, and then it's going to stabilize, and maybe the isotope ratios and CO2 sequestration will go down. Okay? And so I've hinted at this was what we're trying to do. These are a couple figures from the proposal that was just funded, but we're basically going to make these observations: nutrients and CO2, put it into this sausage maker here, grinder, and hopefully we'll have fluxes come out the end. That would be really interesting to have do. And we're also expanding the field area from this one transect. We're also going to move down to this location, Kangerlussuaq, which has it's the banana belt of Greenland. They get about 1,200 millimeters of rain a year, so it's a very rainy, very young system there. So, in conclusion, I'll just end. We think that I think we've shown that there are these distinct weathering reactions depending on whether you're in a deglacial or a proglacial system. Sand dunes in the proglacial system seem to be the main weathering site in those proglacial systems, and that this weathering differs across deglacial watersheds, so that CO2 drawdown is going to decrease with increased weathering and increased exposure age and probably more deglacial watersheds. And then muskox pizzas are actually pretty good. You wouldn't think it looking at these animals, but they're not too bad. So thanks, and I'll take questions.
Time for a few questions.
What's for lunch?
What was the source of the lead isotopes? Is that from lead gasoline or power plants, or I mean, that's far north?
Oh yeah, it's exhaust. In fact, when we first proposed doing lead, then we started reading the lead literature, and there's actually a fairly large literature on lead isotopes in the Greenland ice sheet itself. And they can see, in the ice sheet, they see Roman smelting of lead, and then they see lead dropping off during the Dark Ages, and then lead coming back during the industrialization. And they can pinpoint where that lead comes from based on the isotopic composition. So yeah, it's everywhere. But it screws us up because we can't use lead as a tracer because of it. Yeah, Bob?
How much pyrite is in the rock source, and what is do you know the isotopic value of the sulfur that's being?
No, that's a great question, because I think sulfur isotopes would be a useful tracer to make sure that the sulfate we're seeing comes from the lead isotopes. I mean, excuse me, from the pyrite. In terms of the quantity, surprisingly, I mean, there's not much pyrite there. We haven't quantified it. It's probably on the order of 1% or so, maybe less, not very much. It's sufficient, though, to be oxidized. These iron-rich, there are iron oxides all over the place, and I think largely, well, it comes from all the mineral phases, but a lot of it from the pyrite. Where was I going with that? Pyrite, sulfur, isotopes. Oh, the interesting question is the carbonate. Where's the carbonate come from that we know is weathering? Because this is a gneiss. There's just not any carbonate. We've looked for it. We've used coulometer measurements to try to measure carbonate, and it's on the order of way less than 1%. But it's one of the predominant weathering phases that we can identify there. And it's not, we're not the only ones who see carbonate dissolution in these systems. It happens pretty frequently. And it's just such a reactive source that once you get acid in there, it dissolves away and carries the carbonate. Yeah.
So the total fluxes would depend on the linear edge of glaciation.
From the proglacial system. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the North America, well, all the ice sheets retreated so quickly that there's a big flush of water coming. Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
So I'm still curious about the disproportional large importance of sulfuric acid towards the ocean or towards the ocean as a weathering agent. Why is that? And given that retreating glaciers further upland are further away from the shore, do you expect that there the sulfuric acid will also become more important as a weathering agent?
So they're relative proportions. They're not absolute proportions of the different sulfates because it's out of 100% in this mass balance. Okay. So what we're saying is that the relative amount of sulfuric acid increases towards the coast, right? And I think the reason for that is the time involved. So you have more time because pyrite is less soluble in CO2, and the amount of water that's available. So the coastal, with their higher positive water balance, provides sufficient water to drive that oxidation of the iron sulfides to sulfuric acid. And then as that happens, then that relative proportion of sulfuric acid weathering increases. Yeah. But the blowback to it, if you will, is that there's more, there's still carbonate there that's being dissolved by sulfuric acid through that pathway, which is a CO2 source. Yeah.
Any questions from the students? Don't be shy.
I'm not.
If not, I hope we have pizza down there.
Yes.
Muskox? Yeah.
I don't think so.
Oh,
It's
damn.
exotic. I have one question about, in the coastal area, do you see any evidence of these nutrients stimulating algal growth yet?
We haven't worked in the coast, so we don't really know. I mean, we've worked in Sissemew, but we always went inland, and it is something that we would like to do eventually, but it's pretty far down the radar screen of getting stuff done. Particularly, what we'd really like to do is work in the fjords, right? So the fjords are the first place that this is going to have an implication where this is going to happen. And, well, in fact, Shoily, anybody here know Shoily?
Yep.
Raman, right? So she just came to start working with me on a postdoc and is going to work on this. And she wants to take cores in these fjords to look at basically the silicons and silicon isotopes to see if we can see changes through time in the fluxes of these nutrients and the productivity. So it'd be a fun project to work on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.